So let's see here. Let me go over the format a little bit. So the format, the way these things are working is that we will do, someone comes up, usually a member, going forward, it'll be a member or a guest speaker. They will deliver a polemic, and we'll have about 15 minutes of that, and then we'll do another 15 minutes or so of discussion, debate, Q&A, and then after that, it's just free for open forum, enjoy some more drinks, hang out, and get to know some other folks in the St. Louis area. So let's see here. Oh, yeah, also sponsors. Flirt Social Tonic, Skin Food, Big Wide Sky, and Peter Thiel. Thank you all. So let's move forward here. So tonight, I am elated to introduce a fairly new friend here, Justin Murphy. He is, go ahead and clap, he was gracious to fit us in a schedule between lots of travel. And so just to introduce Justin really quick, he is, he was previously a political science professor at the University of Southampton, and rightly saw the writing on the wall for institutions and universities, and just before the COVIDian era, had bounced out and launched a series of endeavors, Indie Thinkers and Other Life, which has been wildly successful, has tens of thousands of subscribers, very high quality folks, I've met them. And not only that, though, Justin is also a writer, I would say an expert in the antiquities, a podcaster, independent scholar, family man, brother in Christ, and an elite poster, not in that order. And so, Justin, I'm going to welcome you to St. Louis and then give you the floor. So, thank you.
Well, first of all, thanks for the lovely introduction. That's very kind. I must correct only one element, which is I'm no expert in the antiquities. I'm somewhat passionate amateur of some ideas that come out of antiquity, but no expert there. And everything else, most of it I'll take credit for, so I appreciate that. I want to start by saying I'm genuinely privileged and honored to be here. I've always been a firm believer that really the best culture usually comes out of some sort of DIY formation. I've been like a hardcore DIY guy my entire life, ever since I was, got into skateboarding when I was 9 years old, all the way up to, my contemporary, kind of adventure in my current career. I'm a kind of diehard through and through DIY type of guy myself, and the spirit of DIY in this collective and gathering that is being put together here is very obvious and clear, and I love that. I always want to kind of point that out and applaud that. Once you're doing stuff underneath prestigious established institutions, you're usually late, and it's usually a little soft and not particularly notable. Everything truly great in culture usually comes from some group of people who decide to get together in private and do something fundamentally new. So I just want to applaud that. And I also want to say for that reason, I'm particularly grateful and privileged to be here. Not just a guest of your lovely gathering and your series here, but the first guest. I'm truly flattered and happy to be here. Thank you for bringing me out here. So I was asked to give a polemic, and I decided I would like to give you a polemic against free speech. That's right. I'm here to tell you that free speech is not all it's cracked up to be. Now, I'm not going to tell you that we should crack down on free speech or suppress free speech. If you know anything about my own views and writings and my own history, you wouldn't believe that for a minute. But I am going to argue to you tonight that free speech is not what people think it is. And in fact, no particularly meaningful or significant speech ever comes for free. The most important kinds of speech throughout all of history, especially Western history, are paid for. There's always there is intrinsically a price to be paid for any speech that truly matters. And for that reason, the whole idea of free speech, I would say, is drastically overrated. So that's my polemic. I'm going to try to convince you tonight that the entire kind of fantasy that is very popular in the West around this very idea of free speech is vastly overrated and wildly misunderstood. I think, and I hope by the time I'm done, the implication will not be to take away anything from the kind of grandeur and the kind of aura that free speech has for us today, but hopefully to imbue it with something an even more kind of nuanced and sophisticated aura. because if you have to understand the history of free speech, you have to understand kind of where this idea comes from in the earliest kind of moments of the tradition of Western civilization to understand when people talk about free speech, the kind of aura and the kind of prestige or the halo that this concept has. To really understand it fully, you have to go back to ancient Greece. And as I said, I'm no expert or scholar of antiquity in any way, but I'm something of a passionate observer, and I have been studying this particular idea for quite some time. So that's all I can really promise you. What we today call free speech traces back to a very particular concept in the ancient world, which back then was called the transliteration of the concept is parrhesia. And this Greek concept of parrhesia really translates into something more like frank speech. Okay, it's not free speech, but it's frank speech. And it was understood as a very particular and specific kind of practice, a very particular type of speech. And I actually first learned about this through the late lectures of Michel Foucault. And Foucault, gets a bad rap in some circles today, and there are many critiques one can make of him or his biography. But especially his late work and his final lectures were really surprisingly, all about individual liberty and very surprisingly kind of American. One could argue even kind of capitalistic values and attitudes. He was interested in kind of the history of where this kind of ethos came from. So his late lectures are very different than a lot of the work that he's most famous for. And in his final lecture at the Collège de France, he talks about this concept of parrhesia, and he studies in detail how it was practiced. He looks across several ancient texts where this word appears and where people are described as parrhesiasts or parrhesiastes. And I'll give you the short summary of the key criteria that he finds to characterize parrhesia in the ancient world. There are a few that I'm going to omit, but I want to focus on just a few for this talk. First is that with this concept of parrhesia, this idea of frank speech, you say what you really think. You say exactly what you really think in an uncalculating way. You're not trying to impress the person, whether it's an audience or one individual. You're not calculating really anything. It's like you see something that you think is true, and you feel called or moved to express that truth because you think it's important for some genuine reason. So you're not calculating, you're not conditioning it. It must be consistent with how you live. So it can't just be a kind of one-off, kind of sarcastic provocation. You can't just be, trying to, upset someone or make waves. If it's not, it needs to be part and parcel with something that you're doing with your life for it to function as this unique form of frank speech. And finally, most importantly, you have to pay a price for it. And, or at the very least, you have to be exposing yourself to a significant risk of paying some price for it. So the classic example, or the classic kind of textbook example in the ancient world would be giving honest advice to a ruler, like a prince or something like this, or some superior over you, especially if they have the power of life and death over you, someone who could potentially, kill you like a king or something like this. The classic example would be, you actually care about the polity. You really want to give the king an honest piece of feedback because you think it's essential for him to govern justly. But he's not going to like it. This is a classic problem. Everyone knows, if you give the king really harsh feedback, it might be done for you, right? And so if you have the bravery and the courage to nonetheless tell the truth and tell that king something that he doesn't want to hear, something that he could very well kill you for and might very well kill you for, that's an example of what was called parrhesia, or translated as frank speech, okay? And so all of the greatest figures that we remember from ancient Greece had some kind of relationship to this. They were participating in some kind of project as parrhesiasts. One of the classic examples, of course, is Socrates. Socrates was, as many of you know, he paid the ultimate price for speaking freely. As you all know, he was a gadfly, he wandered around engaging in dialogues, and they ultimately put him to death for it. There are some complicated political reasons for that, having to do with his, associations, but the crimes that he was charged with were, of course, the one that everyone remembers is corrupting the youth. But there's also one that people are less likely to remember nowadays, which is the introduction of foreign deities. And so already we start to see there's something actually much deeper going on here. That free speech or frank speech, 10 minutes left? Cool. The frank speech or free speech is actually trafficking in some kind of higher power, let's call it. There's kind of spiritual, there's something spiritual happening here. Even from the beginning, even for someone like Socrates, this kind of radical truth-telling was from the very beginning understood to be trafficking in something almost of another world, okay? That's what I think we begin to see there. Plato, of course, a student of Socrates, and probably the most influential philosopher ever to have lived in the West, famously takes a very different path with his own project. He takes a much more careful and strategic route. You get a sense that everyone's kind of looking at the example of Socrates, and they're like, maybe we need to be a little more careful. Maybe we need to think about how we do this. I don't want to go the way of Socrates. And so a lot of the Greek philosophy after Socrates is kind of engaged in kind of political innovation in a way about like how to do this thing that is public, radical truth-telling that is associated with philosophy. Okay, and so Plato takes a path where he's much more strategic, he's much more shielded. He builds the academy. The academy has layers and layers of kind of filters, right? So you can kind of, there's a public membrane, like anyone can walk up to the academy, and you might have some good conversations on the outside of the academy. But if you really want to get, the dangerous stuff, you got to pay your dues. You got to climb up, the ladder, if you will, and you can kind of go, one level into the classes or whatever. And of course, the most dangerous truths are reserved for, only his finest students that pay the dues for a long time and climb to, prove themselves and climb the ranks. Okay, and so that was Plato's kind of solution to this political problem of free speech, basically. How do you tell the truth boldly, like a philosopher has to, without getting killed? And Plato kind of took this path that was much more strategic and much more, kind of careful and calculated. But then you also have people like Diogenes, who kind of goes in the opposite route. Diogenes kind of goes even more frank speech, even more reckless and wild than Socrates, but he does it in this really clever way that's sort of so aggressive and over the top that you can't take him seriously. So he was almost like a performance artist. He would say really provocative things and he would upset a lot of people, but also he lived in a barrel and had no family or belongings. So that was very much his conscious strategy was, I'm just going to have no dependencies, whatever, so there's nothing they can take from me. There's nothing they can hold over my head. And if they want to kill me, fine, I don't care. All I care about is freedom and speaking the truth and living correctly according to his kind of radical vision of the truth. And he got away with it, so he was not killed. And in fact, he was quite admired. Alexander the Great famously said if he were not Alexander, he would wish to be Diogenes, kind of acknowledging that, again, there's something very enigmatic here. There's something very paradoxical and powerful here about, if you have the guts to speak the truth, if you're willing to pay the price, weird things start to happen that are almost seems to kind of transcend the logic of the social kind of material world and the petty mundane calculations of social consensus and social politics. Okay, and so of course the problem with Diogenes is that most of us don't want to live in a barrel, and Diogenes he was not really able to achieve much influence. Like his name is still remembered today, but it's almost like a joke. He's like a funny novelty character. He was not able to build a school like Plato was. He was not able to kind of build a legacy. He wasn't really able to make a dent in the world. And so part of the lesson there is that that's one strategy for frank speech. If you want to live a life of frank speech, you have to be prepared for them to kill you or prepared for them to take everything away from you. But one way to get around that is just having nothing they can take away, but then you're paying that price. That's a big price as well. You're sacrificing tremendously. You're paying a price by what you're foregoing, right? So in all of these examples, you see that this kind of dream of telling the truth boldly in public is racked with various types of costs. You have to pay the piper somewhere, in other words, is one way to think about this, okay? Now, I would argue to you that the real apotheosis of this entire kind of ancient Greek testing ground and learning ground for the dynamics of parousia really comes with Christianity. In many ways, Christ is the ultimate parrhesiast. And so the word parousia appears across the Bible something like 40 times. If you've read the book of John, you're probably familiar with, it's really quite enigmatic, but 3 times the Holy Spirit is called the Spirit of Truth. Okay, and Christ himself was a self-conscious parrhesiast. This is not well known at all. The term parousia appears in the Bible in reference to Christ more than once, but there's one instance in particular that I think is most perfectly emblematic, which I want to share with you briefly, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about here. It comes in Mark chapter 8, verse 32. It goes, quote, "He spoke plainly about this," he being Christ, and here the term "spoke plainly," that's parousia. So he spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. This is he's preaching, basically. Christ is preaching, in the countryside as he does. That's what he's referring to. So he spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. Quote, "Get behind me, Satan," he said. "You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Okay, so that's as explicit as you can be. It's all laid out perfectly there. Christ is in the New Testament. Christ is explicitly a parrhesiast. And Peter is pretty much, giving him the conventional wisdom that most humans feel and have towards this kind of thing. Like, don't go speaking the truth too loudly. You're going to get in trouble, right? That's how we all kind of, that's all, that's how the typical, calculating, self-preserving, mundane human mind thinks. And here Peter represents that. And Christ says no. Christ says, he basically saying, that's the whole point. Yeah, I know they're going to kill me. That's the whole point. That's the part. That's how this process works. And Christ is obviously ready for that. Okay. And so I could say much more about that, if you look at kind of the sociology of Christianity after these extraordinary events, whatever you make of them, one thing really stands out, which is that however you feel about Christ and the stories in the Bible, it certainly had a lot of staying power. Christ was somehow able to build a long-lasting, durable body of billions of people over time, right? Who sort of identified with this experience, identified with these lessons, and they were able to kind of maintain, kind of share a certain kind of shared consciousness and a shared, a sense of collectivity in the church. And so, whatever you think of Christ or Christianity, Christ. If you think about Christ in the context of Plato, Socrates, and Diogenes, Christ is basically, one way to understand the Christian experience is that it's basically this kind of perfection or apotheosis of the various puzzles and trade-offs that the ancient Greek philosophers were trying to figure out in their kind of groping and human way. It seems that only with Christ do you get all of the things that those first three were trying to get, but you get them in this really explosive and sustainable way. Because Christ is maximally reckless, right? He says the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and he says it, right in the eyes of Pontius Pilate. So maximally reckless, like Diogenes or Socrates. And yes, he pays the ultimate price, but he's able to build, from that emerges a long-lasting kind of institutional body, and more than even that, a kind of shared culture and consciousness of the values of speaking freely, of speaking the truth defiantly. Okay, and so I would argue to you that we today live essentially in the wake of this kind of tremendous cultural formation that begins with the ancient Greeks, and in a certain way is kind of it kind of culminates in the experience of Christianity, whatever you make of that experience. And very much today, the Western world as we know it, where we take it for granted that free speech is a good thing, that speaking the truth boldly and frankly is honorable and admirable and courageous, you really want to think for a second how strange that is. Like, for most human cultures across time and space, free speech is just obviously bad. It's like it's obviously dangerous, right? Like, why would you want every person to say exactly what they think is true? That for almost all of human history, every time and place, that would be seen as just chaos, pure danger, pure downside, terribly annoying and destabilizing and inappropriate. It really took this experience, this kind of concept of frank speech, and this kind of iteration over these centuries, for us to now kind of feel it to be natural or obvious that free speech is a good thing. But the final lesson to take away from this is the lesson that I began this talk with, or the provocation or the polemic I began this talk with, which is just to say that there's nothing about this frank speech which is free. The First Amendment is probably a good idea. I'm certainly supportive of the First Amendment. And the more we can encourage people to speak the truth boldly and frankly, the better. So I certainly support free speech in that sense. But precisely what is interesting and attractive and admirable and significant about free speech cannot be free. It cannot come free. And if you think you're ever going to get it for free, you're just not doing it right. Thank you.
Yeah, just hang up here with me. All right, so this is the part of the conversation here where if anyone has any argument against this, Eric, well, why don't you come to the mic here? Okay. We can pass it back, but I like let's just do this for now, and then you can come up here. Yeah.
Well, the obvious counterexample in the case of Christ is that he chose Peter to be the rock of his church. On the one hand, he said, you're a Satan, get thee behind me. On the other hand, he made him the very foundation stone. I'm a Catholic, and I live with this in the Catholic Church because I know as a Catholic, so many saints are saints precisely because they were persecuted by the church itself. So popes persecute, or their superiors. So can you make something out of that paradox?
I haven't thought about that too much, but I'm tempted to say the church understands what I'm talking about so well that the church is willing to persecute its own members in some sense to honor them or something like this. I don't think that's explicitly what it is, but look, the way I would think about it is that within the church, there have always been fierce debates, and so if you are a serious heretic, from back in the day, the heretic is in a sense paying homage to the church. The heretic cares enough about the church to be a heretic, and so there is this weird way in which the church itself internally kind of executes this process that I'm talking about, all to the greater glory of the church. And so obviously a church wants to maintain dogma and maintain order and certain consistency in what is sort of permitted or allowed, the range of thought. But a lot of the great Catholic thinkers, they're always kind of skirting the edge of what's allowed. They're always testing the limits. In other words, they're always practicing parousia. They're willing, if they really believe the church has gone awry in a certain dimension, the real Catholic will say that frankly, even if it means he's going to be excommunicated or even executed. That's an act of honorable parousia, I would say. Yeah.
Come on up, Tom. I was hoping you'd come up here.
Well, there's another part in the New Testament when you talk about speaking frankly, speaking truth. Mm-hmm. Well, speaking frankly is not always speaking truth. Mm-hmm. Speaking, Pontius Pilate, what is truth? Mm-hmm. Okay, so Christ was a threat to the ruling powers of the Hebrews at the time and the Romans. Why? Because he taught the end of the world was coming. It was an apocalyptical religion. Give away your possessions, follow Christ, concentrate on the Spirit. Christ was wrong. So in the sense that Christ was the foundation of free speech, I would tell you that's a wrong conclusion, okay? Now, the foundation, basically, I think, of free speech, however, does go to, as I was talking to a couple of young men earlier, Martin Luther, because Martin Luther did speak frankly to the church. And in the concept, he told what Christians believe, most Christians believe to be the truth, not necessarily Catholics, which is what, gentlemen? That it's me and it's God. That there is no intermediary between me and God. So no one in this material world owns me. That was Martin Luther. That's what he refused to recant at the Diet at Worms. That's what led to the concept of, as we know in our culture, the individual and individual rights, because in this world, according to Martin Luther and John Locke, the philosopher of the American Revolution, I own myself. Now, in terms of speech, I lean towards Niccolò Machiavelli.
All right. Good arguments. Come on, people, don't be shy. If you need to, chug another beer and come up here and Give us some.
Yeah, have another beer.
The more unhinged, the better. It can be wild. It can be anything.
Do you think Socrates had Asperger's?
That
Do you think Socrates had Asperger's?
that's not how it presents to me. No, he presents to me as pretty socially adept. You know, when you read the dialogues, you get a sense that he's got a pretty good, you know, theory of mind of the other people. Like he kind of knows what's going on. Yeah, that's my sense. But it's an interesting idea. I don't know. What do you think? Make the argument.
He's like, you know, I think he dug into the whole paradoxical, he was really good with wordsmithing.
Yeah.
The whole, there's no perfect circle and stuff. He seemed to be very, and the only, it sounds like a joke, but there is some truth to what I'm trying to ask. He just seems very zeroed in on words and language. And I understand that labeling things and having a language is important, but are you familiar with Gödel Escher Bach?
Sure, I haven't read it myself, but it's a famous book I know of, yeah.
Beautiful book. All you really need to do is read the first 2 chapters, and then you get the gist of it. But it really brings to light a lot of the how language can fall short sometimes.
It's an interesting idea, and I mean, I will say, so there is a field called psychobiography where people do this. There are methods for going over back the life of people and trying to kind of diagnose them medically. And there are examples like, I think, who was it? I believe Jeremy Bentham, like a psychologist, a psychobiographer, made a very good detailed case that Jeremy Bentham was autistic. But it's like a detailed, you know, you can look at their daily habits, you can look at how they talked and how they wrote and what people said about them. And I think, you know, he really kind of matched that profile, or it might be someone else. I think it was Bentham. Socrates, I don't think matches because the Socratic dialogue, which you all know is famous kind of method of philosophizing, it was all about asking questions. It wasn't a very spurgy like mode of speech. It was like very, you know, kind of patient and attuned, you know what I mean? And so, like you know, if he was a spurg, you wouldn't expect him to have that kind of social sensitivity and finesse.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, finesse. You read finesse. I read like this fixation on why.
Yeah. Maybe there's something to it. Maybe you'll have to write the psychobiography of Socrates. Prove me wrong.
Okay, we got one.
Okay, so just so I, know how to interpret you charitably, is your position that free speech is bad, or that free speech is misapprehended, and what it really is this concept of parousia?
Yeah, more like the second. Yeah,
Okay.
I would say to the degree that free speech is the significant and admirable thing that we think of it as, it cannot be free.
Okay.
You must pay a price. And
Sure.
that is demonstrated by the history of parousia and the etymology of free speech and everything we know about this mechanism I described.
Okay, because you talked about the relationship between heretics and heretical speech and the church as it existed in a certain time frame, and I think the way that you put it was that they wouldn't feel the need to be heretical, or they wouldn't be heretics if they didn't care about the church, or if what the church said was not as offensive to them as to prompt a response from them.
Okay.
But what I'm asking is is parousia or free speech or frank speech, whatever it is to you, is it limited to that which advances that sort of non-heretical worldview, or is the heretical speech also parousia as well?
Look, I would say that all social groups basically hate the truth. Like every social formation at a small scale and a large scale, the truth is never genuinely collectively valued, because the truth itself it's always disruptive to social functioning. It's always getting in the way of practicalities, of group cohesion. So you have to understand that from the smallest scale, like the family or the tribe, the truth, the raw, unfiltered, uncalculated truth of anything is generally despised. It's problematic and inconvenient across the board. And that holds true up into, advanced societies. There's rarely ever a real constituency for the raw, aggressive, uncalculated, unvarnished truth. It usually upsets almost everyone in any social order for big reasons and for mundane reasons, like it's just annoying. Socrates was called a gadfly. It's not just that it was like politically disruptive. It was literally annoying people with going on and on about trying to get to the truth.
Okay, so you're defining truth objectively.
Well, what I'm saying is that in any social order, at almost any scale, the truth is generally, speaking the truth, frankly, will be penalized.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the other end of the horseshoe for a second. We all agree that we have the First Amendment and that it's probably good, and that uttering truth is sort of like almost like a divine quest to achieve something, even if it comes with consequences while we're alive. Okay, complete opposite. Do you think lying should be illegal? Should it be a finable offense or punishable by law in any sense, and why?
Sometimes I do think it would be cool to live in a kind of super reactionary, kind of theocratic monarchy or something like that, where like every single form of vice is like brutally punished. You know what I mean? I think the tricky thing there is that is only desirable if the rule set or the law set is truly and correctly calibrated against vice and is enforced fairly and incorruptibly. And those two conditions rarely ever hold reliably. So if you could have a government where every vice was prohibited and punished brutally, if you could guarantee somehow that the laws are truly tracking vice and going to be incorruptibly applied, then I would support that government over the one we currently have. But because that's almost never realistic or to be expected, it's for that reason I would not support the criminalization of run-of-the-mill lying.
Sure. I mean, well, I kind of think, I think vices kind of punish themselves, which is why people get liver disease. But on the other hand, there are types of speech that are protected by the First Amendment. If I tweet, I'm going to rob a bank, or, I'm going to kill Justin Murphy, that's protected.
Yep.
As long as I don't mean it.
Yep.
As long as they don't find out that I have a reasonable cause. So
Right.
kind of a two-part thing. It only, it's only not illegal if I'm lying. It only counts if I don't really mean it. Then in that case, I think that free speech is kind of inevitably bound up in action. There's like a dialectic that's not being addressed here, where you have to have a lifestyle that does. I mean, this kind of bound up in your definition of parousia, if I'm understanding it correctly, but there has to be a way in which your action or your movements correlate to your speech such that it's sensible to others. Otherwise, there's not really a standard you can apply.
That sounds right to me. That sounds like a kind of technical detail about the correct implementation of freedom of speech laws, and I think that sounds sensible to me.
All actors must go to jail. All right.
Just as a point of correction, in our legal system, lying is against the law. If you can't lie to a police officer, you can't lie in an application to the bank. Go through everything, And if you do threaten people, on the internet in a public fashion, you can be prosecuted for a crime, Assault. Things along those lines. You put somebody in fear, you can be. So lying is definitely against the law. Now, my wife asked me, do I look fat in these pants? Of course you don't, dear. That's not punishable. But understand this, in our society, almost everything else is.
There we go.
Oh, we got two more here. You might have to come up here because it's not long enough. And then you're up next.
Yeah, I just want to know from your perspective where you put truth on the kind of moral hierarchy, because it sounds like you're kind of taking this story of Jesus, which is your, I assume you're a Christian, because you said you were a brother of Christ, and saying that he was the best kind of example of this person who practiced speaking frankly and telling the truth despite all consequences, right? So then Socrates also told the truth and then suffered death from it, right? But is his life worth less than somebody else that he could have gotten killed for the truth, or like how many people's lives is like the truth worth if it's like a part of your moral framework. And like say there's like societies where you can't tell the truth, but everybody like lives a great life and like lives much longer than in a society where people are like suffering and dying because of some, say, like mimetic brain virus where people are telling the truth, but it makes everyone sad and suicidal or something.
Okay, so 2 questions there. Let me do the first one. I think you're kind of asking, like, how do you think about sort of this frank truth-telling if it's competing with other values or goods and you have to trade them off? How do you value them or prioritize them? I'd say a few things. One is that I think I sort of like this idea of vocation, and I think like not everyone is called to do the same types of things, and I do not believe that everyone has some sort of constant ethical obligation to tell the truth as radically as possible in all contexts and pay the price in all contexts. No, I don't think that makes any sense. I think that some people will have a vocation to do so more than others, and some people will be called to do so. And usually you kind of know it if you're in a context or a situation where something true, not only do you know it, but it's sort of, you live it. It's something that you feel and know, and you know that saying it would be good for the world and for the people around you, but you know that saying it is going to get you some kind of trouble, and you're tempted not to say it because you just want to avoid the inconvenient consequences. I think people find themselves in such a situation, or they don't. And if you do find yourself in such a situation, it's only then, really, that I think you have the obligation to stare down those consequences and speak the truth and take your licks. But it does not mean you have to go constantly getting yourself into that situation. It doesn't mean that every situation is that situation. And there could even be situations where, you're kind of tempted to tell some dangerous truth, but you decide against it because you just, there are good reasons why in a particular context it's not the right thing to do. Even in the New Testament, there are kind of some interesting examples of this. Like, Christ is a tremendous and impressive ecclesiast, but he does also sometimes he kind of runs away. But what's interesting is he often runs away when people are about to really love him. Like, he runs away from like being a celebrity. So he doesn't want to like take clout, basically. He's not a clout chaser. He runs away from clout chasing opportunities, but it's when like the cops want to kill him that's when he like leans in and is the ecclesiast. So you don't want to be like a ecclesiast to get attention or to be impressive or because you want to be, or you want everyone to like you and think you're cool. Those are all like bad reasons to do it, and you should not do it for those reasons. So it's usually something you find yourself in, and like Christ says a few times, like, my hour has not yet come. He uses, and I think that language is very interesting. And usually I feel like you have a sense when your hour has come. Like, when it's not, I don't have to die on this hill. But over time, it kind of accumulates, and at a certain point, you kind of reached your rope's end, and you're just kind of fed up with some BS lies that you're kind of being forced to kind of endure. And then at a certain point, you feel, okay, my hour has come, and if I don't say it now, then I'm shameful, and I would be ashamed of myself. That's how I think about it.
Yeah, I guess so. It sounds like you're saying that truth is kind of like useful as a tool to serve the greater good. Like, if you're in a scenario where you could do a lot of good in the world by telling the truth, you should do so even at great risk to yourself.
I don't think of it in that utilitarian way. I think of it actually quite the opposite, as a kind of a deontological duty or obligation that is actually quite divorced from consequences. Like, I think we have an obligation to the truth itself. Like, the truth, just the objective order of things. We have an obligation to kind of, as best as we can, kind of be faithful to that.
So even if a lie would do a lot of good, you still shouldn't lie. Like, it would be a vice.
Right. So this is the question of like strategic lying, and I think I come down with St. Augustine on this, in that I don't think strategic lying is justified. Now, I'm not judging anyone, and in certain contexts, you have to kind of make your own decisions, but. Yeah, I tend to think like absolute hardcore truth telling is like the most consistent and defensible single principle. Yeah.
All right, just 1 second because he hasn't asked one yet.
So I wonder how you respond to this framing. I buy your notion that no speech is free. It seems to me that you could understand parousia in the context, or as an aristocratic virtue. I mean, the Mycenaeans, the early, Aristoi, they referred to themselves as the truth tellers, right? And so I wonder if perhaps the cost that is paid ultimately, well, let me also add this to it. It seems to me that orthodoxy is ultimately a sort of herd behavior, right? That not speaking the truth is a necessary component of maintaining your status in the center of the herd, right? And not to mention that from a sort of Pareto Moscow perspective, most people are incapable of speaking the truth. They don't know enough outside of what they have, how they've been informed by the motion of the herd to be able to even speak truth. So and then therefore I was going to say the cost that is paid for truth, for parousia, is literally becoming an aristocrat, doing what is necessary to be a shepherd of the herd as opposed to just being a member of it.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, there's sort of two kind of notions of the aristocracy. There's sort of like the beginning of an aristocracy, and then there's sort of like the degenerated, kind of tail end of an aristocracy. And these are very different types of people, because if you talk about I think you're talking about a certain notion of kind of the aristocratic spirit or something like this, which I can understand and respect. But if you're just talking about the aristocracy, I mean, the aristocracy as a historical kind of entity was, I think, for all intents and purposes, quite invested in, maintaining status quo order, right? So the aristocracy would be, a kind of police force that is quite intent to kind of shut out any, parrhesiastic truth-telling. The other thing that makes me sort of doubt that, it's a fundamentally aristocratic practice is that, not to get too biblical, I know it's come up, but for whatever reason, it's just a lot of my source material for this is, several of the apostles. So in the Acts of the Apostle, parousia is all over the Acts, because that's kind of what characterizes these guys in the wake of Christ's death and resurrection. The apostles are going out and speaking wildly. I mean, they're getting themselves in all kinds of danger preaching Christ, the truth of Christ, in hostile contexts. So the word parousia appears all throughout Acts. And what's interesting is that several of the apostles were illiterate. I know John was understood to be illiterate. I forget the others who were illiterate. But this has been studied, and it's quite notable and surprising that these illiterate fishermen are doing what was understood to be a noble behavior. Because in that sense, you're right. Like, obviously, in the Greek context, the only people speaking in public at all, are fairly elite, citizens and all of this, right? So in some sense, obviously, yeah, you're right in that sense. It's a noble virtue. But that's incredibly problematized by Acts and by the story of Christianity, because here you have illiterate fishermen who are doing these like notable, admirable, brave, and even intelligent kind of speech acts with great bravery. And this has been noted. This was noted at the time as quite paradoxical. Like, how is this noble activity being done by these illiterate fishermen? So it's complicated.
All right. Also, did you have something as well? Okay. Yeah. All right. We'll keep going with newbies first.
All right. I'm going to strangle my ortho bro with the cord here. So, good talk is marked by good comments. And, yeah, I think we're kind of circling around the target here in that, one, I think there's a difference between a controlling elite and an aristocracy, right? An aristocracy is one that has its roots in being focused toward virtue, right? So when the only people speaking in Greek civilizations were doing so were ones that had been meaningfully educated, didactically educated in the the folkways, the culture, the history, the traditions, and the benefits of their people, right? So you had an aristocracy that was aligned with civilizational success, right? I don't think you can characterize an aristocracy as a parasitic or opportunistic ruling class, and I think that's why you see in Acts, for instance, that you're generating wisdom from below, right? As now, the temple was filled with the money changers, right? The public institutions were in the process of corruption. Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
And so we're talking here in a room full of people that I think consider sort of more than the average bear the nature of what they say and how they say it, right? Is the democratization of free speech at odds with fundamental truth-telling, right?
Yes.
And so this goes, it's another one of these neato concepts like voting that has perhaps been broadened beyond its useful size,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
When you have people that are purely recipients of the public coffers, again, it's not my quote, it's an old one, they'll vote themselves wealthy, right?
Sure.
Similarly, your noise to signal ratio goes up when people understand, and this is common, I think, across a variety of fields. They understand the benefit, but not the corresponding obligation.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
People believe that A, free speech is free, and B, no consideration has to be made other than how they're feeling in the moment, right? And that seems to me not only to be incorrect, but sinful, right? In the sense that when your speech is not informed by the truth, and I think many of us see the ultimate truth in our faith, then A, of what use is free speech?
Yep.
And B, what, if anything, can be done, and this is, I guess, utilitarian, but to align the utilitarian aspect of speech with its higher purpose that you described?
So it's a great question, and you made several very astute and correct points. But I would just point out that it's this price-paying element of parousia, properly understood, is precisely what solves the problem of the hoi polloi. So democratic chit-chat that you're talking about as a major problem, as the flooding of the polity with noise, essentially. This problem of excessive democratic chit-chat and noise, it's precisely because for them, for that type of democratic chit-chat, that talk is cheap. And this phrase we have today, talk is cheap, is it's referring to exactly what I'm talking about, in this discussion of parousia. And so the requirement for free speech, the requirement for the speaker to pay a price is, in other words, you can think of that as that's how the speaker proves that they really mean it and that it really means something, because that's the only reason they're willing to pay the price. And so it's actually a solution, and you'll be interested to know that the word parousia in ancient Greek was used. It actually had two meanings, two absolutely opposite meanings. We have some examples of that today. It's sort of weird, but sometimes the word means literally opposite. In ancient Greek, it was also used as a pejorative to describe democratic chatter, because it's sometimes the technical translation of it is parousia really translates into like saying everything or saying anything. And so it's really this sort of like effusive, reckless, uncalculating, kind of a fusion of words. There's a noble form of that if you're speaking the truth and you're paying a price for it. And then there's a pejorative sense of that if you're just a person blabbering. And the word was used to actually describe both. But there are two distinct different mechanisms and different practices, distinguished by whether or not they're paying a price. So I would argue the paying of the price is what separates the kind of aristocratic, noble truth-telling from the democratic chit-chat. And if we have a problem with too much speech today, it's precisely because talk is too cheap.
All right, we've actually gone to 30 minutes of Q&A. So I know there's a lot of other good questions, but we're going to wrap it up here, and we're just going to do normal conversation, open forum for now on. So feel free to ask your questions to Justin after this, and grab another drink. And thank you all for coming out to Oyarsa, and feel free to hang out as long as you want. So thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. It's fun. Thanks, Tyler. That's fun. Thank you.